you very much for coming, either in person or online here. I am actually quite excited to get a chance to talk about this a little bit. I was very creative in naming this talk Some Preliminary Thoughts on Korean Video Games. So for those of you who don't know, I'm assuming all of you do at this point, but my name is Ryan Scheiding. I'm an assistant professor here and DM at Georgia Tech. And once again, I'm just really happy that you're all here. Okay, so background for this new project, because I think that those of you who've gotten to know me and gotten to know my work know me as doing essentially exclusively Japanese games at this point. So doing Korean games might be a little bit different, and it definitely is. So the background for this project is that I was actually working on another paper with a colleague of mine, Andre Zanescu. We're going to write about samurai representations in Japanese video games. And in particular, I was really interested in the idea that I played a lot of samurai games, and in samurai games, the one period that they tend to skip is when Japan invaded the Korean Peninsula. So they weren't really invading Korea. They actually thought of themselves as invading China, and they were doing that through the Korean Peninsula. But still an invasion of the Korean Peninsula. So I think quite naively, I thought that there would be some sort of a parallel where it would just be like, well, they don't represent it in Japanese games, so I'll find some Korean games that do represent it, then talk about the differences and, like easy conference paper. But I found that that wasn't the case, and that I needed to really reconfigure what it was that I was doing and how I was thinking about the issues. And it just expanded out into something that I think is going to be quite an extensive project, rather than just this small conference paper that I would be thinking about one time in the context of my studies of Japanese games. It is someone just showed up at the door and it's locked. I get distracted so easily. Good morning. Hello. All right. So in this, so in taking up this project, I needed to expand the way that I was thinking, is the best way to put it. So that's how this project started. Why study Korean games is that I really did, I just started to see that as a much more broad avenue than the narrow way that I was thinking about it, that could enhance some of the work that I was already doing, but also be a new, interesting project that I think I can move forward with. But the big question that really started to strike me was that how can I do responsible research? So I have quite an extensive experience in game studies and in Japanese game studies. And of course, in my original training was in history. So I wasn't completely unaware of Korean history. You kind of can't study 20th century Japanese history without learning a little bit of 19th and 20th century Korean history, 19th and 20th century Chinese history. So I had a little bit of background, like I had a general idea of what was going on there, but I realized that it wasn't really enough, and that if I wanted to study Korean games, that I would need to expand out from that narrow viewpoint that I already had. Particularly problematic would be the idea that most of my background in Korean history was through the lens of Japanese history. And when we're talking about like colonialism as occurred in the 20th century, that's not a great lens and starting point. And then, of course, the fact that I am like a Canadian, non-Korean person, that can also be problematic if you don't if you don't think about it. We have another person coming in with a locked door here. This will all be in posterity. Hello, good morning. All right, so in considering this background, I had to come up with a research methodology. So obviously I was going to play a bunch of Korean video games, but I knew that that wouldn't be enough, and that I needed to do something in combination with those, with playing those games. So I came up with like this three-pronged research methodology that I don't think is like particularly innovative or new or anything like that, but it's just the sort of stuff that I wanted to do to give myself a better grounding in this research. So in those research methods, like I was doing some background readings, I started some Korean language study, and I went and did some field research in Korea this past spring break, which was a really cool thing to do. But taking these three things in combination, I thought would be really useful for me in that I would be able to analyze Korean games, I guess what we would call a little bit more responsibly. So background readings, I did a combination of like some general reading and scholarly works as well. I will always take I will always take historical approaches when given the opportunity to take historical approaches. And I'm a really big historiography person. So on the right-hand side here, we have some scholarly works. I decided to start with generalized histories of Korea. Actually, no, that's not correct. When I started studying, I actually started with Korean folklore and myths because that was something that I was just reading on weekends. So I started by reading some collections of Korean folklore, myths, and legends, which was really interesting. My favorite is a story called Tahong, which I will not spoil, but if you get a chance to look it up, it's really, really good. From there, once I decided that I was going to take on this project a little bit more thoroughly and as part of my research, that's when I got into some more scholarly works. So these generalized histories of Korea is where I started, and I tried to get books that were from the Korean perspective or written by Korean authors. This book by Huang was particularly interesting because it was a full history of Korea, but it was done episodically. So he took one major event that happened during each period of Korean history. And we're talking like one a decade or something along those lines, and built out the book that way as a way of like displaying how the relevance of Korean history, which I thought was really cool. Once I moved past that and decided that what I was most interested in was the samurai invasion, which in Korea is called the Imjin War from 1592 to 1598. I started to read some histories on that. There's a scholar who does a lot of like samurai history named Stephen Turnbull. And I read a couple of his works. One was a general outline of the Imjin War, and another was about Japanese castles that they built in Korea during that time, most of which are completely gone now. Like if you were to go and try and see them, it'd be one of those things where it's like, here's 4 feet of a wall on the side of a hill or something like that. But if you know what you're looking at, apparently you can like map out the whole thing and see it. So I started to read a lot of those. Of course, I consulted historical maps. I mean, I know generally what the Korean Peninsula looks like and is shaped like, but looking at these maps and seeing the path that the samurai took was a pretty useful thing for me to see as well. And then, of course, I had to combine this with game studies because I am studying games. Florence Chi is really well known for studying PC bangs, which are like PC rooms in Korea that used to be exceedingly popular and now still exist, but my understanding is that they're not as popular. Basically, they are just these spaces where people could come and rent a small space and you can play on a PC, hang out with your friends, and they were really interesting social spaces as well. So Florence Chi just published a book on that in the last year, and I read that. And I'm working through Dalyong Jin's book on the Korean game industry. It's an older work now at this point. I think it's like 10 or 15 years old. The reason that I'm having so much trouble getting through it is because it is a very traditional political economy, like Vincent Mosco stuff. And that's a little bit difficult for me to read. I enjoy that work. I'm glad that I'm not doing that work, but I'm glad that it exists and that it's out there so that we have like reference to those sorts of things. On my general reading side, I started to read some contemporary Korean literature as well. Hong Kang just won the Nobel Prize, the first Asian woman to win the Nobel Prize. So that's exciting on its own, but as the first Korean person to win the Nobel Prize in literature, I've been reading a few of her works. Hwang Sok-young wrote this book called Princess Bari, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But it's so far one of my favorite things that I've read in a long, long time and has been influenced by one of the games I was playing for this research. I am flying to Chicago on Wednesday, and I have this poetry collection that's ready to go for my flight out. And I'm also trying to get myself to read some more Korean news, the English language versions to the Korea Times. So I've got that on my phone. I just can't find time in the day to actually be reading a newspaper, but I think that it'll be useful for the research. someone just came in and the door is open and no longer locked. So it actually doesn't need to interrupt me, but it does. All right. So that's what I was doing background reading wise. The next thing that I've done, and this is not chronological, this was all happening at the same time, is that I started Korean language study. I started lessons in October. So far I've learned Hangul, which is the Korean alphabet. So I have fun writing that every day as part of my practice, and I'm reading a little bit now as well. So I know some key conversational phrases. Basically, once I started doing this research, I realized that I really wanted to go to Korea. And I thought that it would be kind of like dangerous to myself to go to a country where I don't know anyone and don't speak the language at all. But I also thought that it was like a courtesy and a nicety that I should probably try and learn some of the language before I go somewhere. So I plan to continue the lessons as part of this research project. This started out as kind of what's the word that I would use here? It came out as a curiosity. I was just like curious about the language, and I thought, I'll try this. After my utter failure to learn Japanese, I was like, I would probably utterly fail at this, but that's not been the case so far. So I want to keep doing this and to keep learning and hopefully be able to integrate that deeper into the research as well. But there's already been some like fun language episodes that I've had that have started to give me a little bit more context. I recommend At Korean with Jihei. I found this person through an app called Preply. But if you want to learn Korean, this is a person that you can learn Korean from. So I had her send me over this graphic yesterday. But Jihei is great. Interestingly enough, I think that after dealing with me as a language student, that she might win the first Nobel Prize in patience. Very, very good. There's the contact info if you are interested. All right. So beyond the language study, and before we get into the games, we're 12 minutes into this 40-minute talk about games, and I haven't said anything about games yet, but we're almost there. This past March, or earlier this month, I should say, I spent a week in Korea going to museums. Now, of course, this was something that I used like startup funds for, so I had to book all this stuff like well in advance. And when I booked everything, I was sure that what was going to happen is that I was going to find a bunch of Korean games about the Injin War, and that I would go to museums about the Injin War, make a comparison between the two of them, and be able to say to be able to write something for this conference paper or for a conference paper beyond that. But as I've been saying, it kind of hasn't fit that perfectly in the games. So I still did go to these museums, but now they're just giving me a little bit of a different context. So over the course of a week, I think I went to seven or eight different museums. But the most important are the three that I have pictures for here, which are the Jinju National Museum, the National Memorial Museum of Forced Mobilization under Japanese Occupation, and then I actually don't have a picture of it here. That's the UN Museum. The UN Museum, the top left corner is the UN Museum to the Korean War. But then I also went to the Korea War Memorial in Seoul. So the Jinju National Museum is very interesting. Because I thought that it was just a museum when I was doing my research, but I showed up there that day and found out that it is a complete recreation of a 16th century Korean fort that was at Jinju. So there is a museum in the middle of it, but you get to walk around and, like look at cannons and look at the reconstructed gates and all these things. It's also a public park that's free for people who are from Jinju. So I was there on a weekend and I paid like 2,000 won or whatever it was to get in. But there was also just a lot of like elderly people just strolling around, enjoying their Sunday, sitting on benches, that sort of thing. So it's very atypical for what we would call like a war museum, in that it's this public space in the middle of the city. You can like look out from one of the gates and see like the Korean version of Walmart that's called G Mart, I believe. Which was like a really cool juxtaposition to experience. One really interesting thing about Jinju is that historically it was attacked twice by the Japanese during the Injin War. First time the Korean defenders were able to successfully defend the fort. The second time it fell. When it did fall, the Japanese generals had this like celebratory party on the first night, and they, I guess we would use the term, invited a bunch of like Korean dancing girls to entertain them that night. And after the festivities, one of the dancers, her name is Nonge, invited the lead Japanese general to like meet her out beside this rock. The form, the museum where it stands today is in the original like spot. So the fort is right along the river, and there's this rock that sticks out there. So she enticed him out to the rock, and the story goes that she embraced him and threw herself into the river, drowning them both. And now, when you go to the museum to this day, there's a little shrine to her. So you can go and see the rock. I took a selfie with the rock, and you can go to the little shrine and burn incense for her. I don't know if this is a true story, because even when you like read about it at the museum, there's about a 20-year difference between when they wrote down the story and when it supposedly happened. So who knows what the actual historical truth is, but it's a very interesting representation. And in the bottom left-hand corner here, you can see this is actually quite large. I think that's like 10 feet high or something like that. And it's on the side of this big monument that is in the middle of the Jeonju National Museum. I also went to I'm just going to call it the Forced Mobilization Museum in Busan. I'm not going to say too much about that. It's a museum to 20th century Japanese colonialism, and it was quite horrific. I'm glad that I went. I'm glad that I got to learn a little bit more about that stuff. But there was a lot in there about about comfort women, about forced labor, about all the atrocities that occurred. So much less of while the Jeonju National Museum was like fun, the Mobilization Museum was very, very intense. I didn't know this at the time when I booked the trip. Literally directly next door to the Forced Mobilization Museum is the UN Museum to the Korean War. Which I have in the top left-hand corner here. Does anybody know what the significance of 38 is? I'm going to assume that nobody in the audience does either. The 38th parallel is basically like the made-up line that delineates North Korea from South Korea. So at the end of World War II, when the Russians started to invade former Japanese territories before the atomic bombings occurred. And then the Americans, trying to stem that, also invaded Korea from the south. And the 38th parallel is where they delineated the two countries. And the 38th parallel would become the demarcation for war during the Korean War. So as soon as the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, that got the UN to join the war. Then the UN pushed all the way up to like the top. Well, they had been pushed all the way back to Busan. Then they pushed all the way up into North Korea. China joined the war and pushed all the way back down. And then after like this 5-year war, they just ended at the 38th parallel. But when you are at the UN Museum, they have like a prelude to war. And then when you go into like, they're going to start teaching you about the war, they make you walk across the 38th parallel. Which I found to be it's interesting. After doing that day, I also went to I found out that the UN Memorial Cemetery is like a 5-minute walk from there. So I went there and visited all the Canadian graves. And then it started snowing, which is not a thing that's supposed to happen that time of year. So Forced Mobilization Museum to Korea, and UN Cemetery made for not so happy of a day in Busan, but glad that I did it. Glad that I went and saw it, and certainly started to change the way that I was thinking about how wars represented like in a Korean context. Then one of the last museums I went to was the Korean War Memorial. I think it's called the War Memorial of Korea, or National War Memorial of Korea in Seoul. And it is a complete opposite, because it is like one of those like rah celebratory war memorials. When you get to it's this huge grounds. Outside, they've got all of these like decommissioned or like recreations of like planes and ships and helicopters and tanks and stuff like that. And you're supposed to like walk around and look at them. And then there's some like really interesting language within the museum itself about like the need to defend the country and these sorts of things. However, so I spent about like 5 hours in there the one day going through everything. It certainly makes sense. The people that I most commonly saw in there were military recruits in uniform. So you can kind of see like the purpose of what the museum is for. I mean, when you're the Korean War technically never ended because they didn't really sign the armistice. So they are still technically at war. And they have military conscription, military service before the age of 29. So having a thing like the National War Museum makes sense because you need to like prop up that like military machine in some way and glorify it. At least that was my like interpretation of it in the like spending the time there and trying to put it into a little bit of further context. Okay, so all of this stuff was happening in parallel with my actually studying games. So I have been playing a bunch of Korean games, and now I have some preliminary thoughts about it, hence the title of today's talk. Okay, so basically, I just want to break this down a little bit into how I'm going about doing this exactly. So I've got like a few like little sets of questions here. And the first one is, what is a Korean game? Because this is like, I think, very important to think about like when we're trying to do these categorizations. And it sounds simple, but once you start to like peel back the layers, you need to think about it a little bit more. So for my purposes, I am defining a Korean game as games that are developed primarily in Korea. Typically, when you do that, you're talking about games that are, they're cultural artifacts. They're made in Korea by largely Korean people. And I don't want to go so far as to say that they're targeted at Korean audiences, because that's actually not something that I've been finding so far. But in defining Korean, that's what I have been going with primarily, is developed in Korea. This is getting kind of interesting as well, because a recent move within the Korean games industry is that Korean games are not necessarily being published by Korean publishers. There's been some more like prominent partnerships with non-Korean companies. I think the two biggest being Sony, partnering to release Stellar Blade. And then something that was like really interesting to me is Amazon Games publishing Throne and Liberty, which is an MMO, brand MMO, which was really interesting to me because I didn't think Amazon Games existed anymore. I thought that they had finally just kind of like surrendered and left the industry. But evidently not. They are publishing some games. So just generally, when I'm saying what is a Korean game, I'm defining it as something that is developed primarily in Korea. So where have I been playing? This is an interesting thing as well, because I'm making, I think, a bit of a controversial decision in what I'm playing so far, is that I've been playing console games on the PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and I've been playing some mobile games. But the only reason the mobile games are in this study right now is because I had already played them before I started this. I've been focusing almost exclusively on console games, which I think is a little bit controversial because PC is by a wide margin like the most popular of the platforms in Korea itself, and there's obviously a lot of like PC gaming in the West, but I am been focusing. I'm a console gamer, like in general, but I've been focusing more that way because I am interested in the way that Korean games interact with like largely Japanese companies. Particularly when we're like doing so much time studying colonialism and studying a literal instance of one nation invading another. I thought that would be an interesting starting off point. One thing that I have read is that, interestingly, consoles were banned in Korea until very recently. I think it's like 2004 or something like that. So it's like the PlayStation 2 generation. But even then, PC has been so like deeply ingrained and built into the There's people talking badly outside now. We can't win with this door. Once again, easily distracted. If someone like turns the lights on and off, well, I'm going to have to say something about that. Okay. So I have been focusing largely on console games because of those reasons. So what have I been playing? I've been playing games about Korea. I've been playing what are I? Oh, sorry. What have I been playing? I have been playing anything that I can find, basically, that is that can be considered like a Korean game. So because I'm like focusing on console, there aren't a ton of examples, and this is the first time in my life where I didn't really know a lot off the top of my head. Usually, when it comes to like Japanese games, there's a ton of stuff I immediately know. It's like, oh, that's a game that was made in Japan. This would fit into what research projects I'm doing, this, that, and the other. When it's come to the Korean games, I've just been like going to Google and sometimes just Googling Korean console games. I do that every now and then to try and, build up the algorithm so that it will like send me stuff. So I had started with Stellar Blade, and then I've just been playing anything that I can get my hands on. So far, my top five are Eight Doors, A Room's Afterlife Adventure, is my favorite Korean game that I've played so far. It's made by a small indie studio and then published by NeoWiz. This ties into that novel that I was talking about earlier called Princess Bari. This game is based on Korean folklore. Princess Bari is in very, very briefly in like the Korean shamanistic tradition. Princess Bari like consoles the souls of the dead as they go into the afterlife. But then this game has like a bit of a different slant on it, where you play as a character named Arum, and she's going to try and find her father's soul in the afterlife. The novel that I was talking about earlier modernizes the whole tale, and it's about a woman escaping North Korea during the famines in the 1990s, and it was an incredible novel. But this was the like best example I could find of a game that is tying together like history and folklore in the Korean perspective. And funnily enough, it has nothing to do with the Inchim War. It has nothing to do with Japanese colonialism. It has nothing to do with the Korean War. So it's got me to like reconfigure a little bit, and has me reading more folklore and thinking that maybe when we're talking about historical Korean games, that we could go this way a little bit. I also really enjoyed Stellar Blade, the First Descendant, Cat Snack Bar, which is on the right there, which is an Android game and probably available on iPhones as well. It is the most adorable, amazing game that I've ever like played on my phone. It also has this incredible soundtrack that just like immediately pulls you in, and essentially you are just a cat that runs various restaurants and like sells sandwiches to other cats. They are very industrious cats. And then finally, completely opposite, there's this game called The Coma. There's a series called The Coma, and this is one of the few that it's a horror series made by another like small indie studio, but it also has a lot of like historical representation. It is the only game that I found so far that directly references Japanese colonialism and the Japanese Korean history and how they come together. All right, so when we're defining a project like this, it's also important to say what I'm not been playing. So I am not playing games that are about Korea, so like representations of Korea from other companies. So the biggest example I can think of is there's a lot of like real-time strategy games on PC where there will be like a mode where you can play the Korean War, or a mode where you can like play in the during the Inchim War. But these are usually made by Western companies, and I'm not playing that stuff right now. I'm also not playing stuff that is played in Korea. So I'm not interested in StarCraft. I'm not playing StarCraft. I'm not talking about StarCraft. There are other people who have written a lot about Korean people playing StarCraft. And that's not a thing that I'm like interested in. I'm more interested in the cultural representation. So there's other examples that like fall into that as well. But I'm not interested in like esports or, I think Overwatch was big in Korea for a little while too. Like that's not what I am. That's not what I'm looking at. I'm not saying that it's not interesting. I'm just saying that that's too wide of a net to cast right now. So generally, this is what I've been playing. This is what I've been enjoying. And these are the things that are starting to inspire the project. But we can now move into the early patterns that I'm finding. So from my original like research question, which was like, how do Korean games represent the Indian War? Largely the answer is that they don't. There's a little bit there. Of course, I'm still searching around. I certainly haven't found anything that could be called like a major release that has like a lot of this representation. Even the things that I was saying about like the Coma, the Coma is like a smaller series, does release everywhere, so it's on consoles and everything like that. But it's also a lot of those references are like buried in files that you find. You can play the entire game and not see any of that until the most recent one they released, which is called the Coma 2B, where you actually go into like a mine that the like it's difficult to describe, but it is in the Coma. It's like history or time doesn't really move, so you can go into this mine and there's like the Japanese soldiers who are forcing Koreans to like dig out the mine. But other than that, there's just not a lot of that historical representation in a direct way that I thought very naively that I'd be able to write about easily and to analyze. There is, however, a prevalence of like folklore and horror. So I was talking a little bit about Eight Doors and the Coma. There's something else that a student just suggested to me that's based in like the Joseon era. Which name escapes me because I haven't played it yet. So it seems like there's some throughways into folklore. And I am hoping the more games that I play like that and the more of those that I study, that there will be some like veiled references to later in history. Or if not, it's another way of representing representing the past. So after 6 months of research, here are some other early patterns and things that I've been thinking about. Of course, I've been thinking about genre. I think like the biggest stereotype is that when you mention Korean games, people are like, "Oh, you mean MMOs?" So many MMOs are Korean, and I played a couple of them. So I've got the picture for Throne and Liberty on there. In the bottom right-hand corner is the First Descendant, which is a third-person looter shooter, but honestly, like. Somebody referred to those as MMOs to me once in like passing in conversation. And since they said that, I was like, yeah, looter shooters are just MMOs. They're just MMOs with a different coat of paint. But like that is that's in there. I also played a little bit of Black Desert Online, but when you join a game like a decade after it's been released and it's an MMO, it's like impossible to wrap your head around. But I gave myself like a shot to try that a little bit as well. So genre-wise, like I'm trying to think of Korean games beyond MMOs because I think that's the stereotype there. But as I said, I've been finding a lot of like good horror games. I've been finding a lot of good platformers, a lot of good even mobile games, which I'm not a big fan of, including Godzilla Defense Force in the top left-hand corner there, which was made by Nexon. But lots of interesting things with genre that I think could expand out. I'm still mulling design mechanics because I think one of the pressures that you like start to feel when you define a project as like I'm studying Korean games is that you want to be like what makes the games Korean, and to start to like fall into the trap of like, well, there must be like Korean design principles that we can talk about, or there must be something distinctive that makes a game Korean. And so far, I haven't really found that. I don't want to like discount that it is that it is a thing. I don't want to like completely like remove that possibility, but I also find myself like really in between. There's not anything when I like pick up any of these games that makes me instantly go like, ah, yes, this is very Korean. And it's something that as I'm playing all these games, I'm mulling over because I very much, locked myself into the idea that I'm playing Korean games. But I'm starting to let myself understand this as that there's design mechanics that are like cross-cultural, of course, and that might be a better way of thinking about it rather than trying to nail down a Korean game as anything other than just a game that was made by Korean developers. This leads me into like my as cultural product stuff. I think that it's really important to, while separating away from this idea that there might not be specific Korean design mechanics, that there are like these games are still cultural products. They are part of Korean culture, and that they can inform us of numerous ways of thinking or ways of like interacting with Korean culture. So typically the way I do that is through history. I mean, honestly, when you're playing a game that's about like Korean folklore and adapting it into a new medium, like that is so clearly a cultural product. And when we talk about like representations of history, it's another like cultural product. It's taking a lens, capitalizing on some of these things that I learned through like going to museums and reading the history of these sorts of things. Those ones are obvious, but I'm trying to leave myself open to other like ways that these are representations of Korean history, or sorry, of Korean culture. Haven't quite locked in on what that is exactly. I need to keep playing. I need to keep working through these ideas. But it's something that it's an early some early ideas that I have here. And then one thing that like I don't know what to do with this, but I also felt like it might be irresponsible not to mention it, is that there's a lot of gendered representation. And at first I thought that I might be the problem and that I was locking in on games that were representing women in a certain way. But I'm also starting to find that it's in a lot of Korean games. And I don't quite know what to do with that. Stellar Blade, I think, is like a really good example of that. For those of you that are not aware of what Stellar Blade is, it is a AAA action game, but the character is very, very. I don't want to like. The character is very, very sexualized. But the way that they designed this character is they like contracted this Korean Instagram model and like 3D scanned her into the game, and then the game is very, very like voyeuristic in the way that she's depicted. And I don't want to seem like I'm clutching my pearls and that I think that this is scandalous or anything like that. And it's still a great game, but I'm finding that there's a lot of like representation that is very juxtaposes like all the other stuff that I'm finding out about Korean culture. Like Korean women have outside of that like fun story of Name, like the strong woman who's standing up to a Japanese general, no less, and the like very deep historical ties that Korean women have in literature. A lot of Korean literature has like this tradition of women writers that I think with Hong Kong winning the Nobel Prize is like very fitting because Korean women have a huge presence within Japanese literature or within Korean literature. And so then to see these representation games, like I said, I don't know what I'm going to do with that, but it's a thing that I've noticed and I don't want to like sweep under the rug and not mention at all. I don't know if I'll write directly about this. I think there's people who are a lot more qualified than that, but I also feel like we can't just, ignore things like that as well. So those are the early patterns that I'm finding. Limited historical representation, prevalence of horror and folklore, and then all these interesting things that I'm trying to think of that basically just tie into like, how are these a representation of like Korean culture? So future trajectories, and then we'll have about like 15 minutes for questions, which I think will be good. So where does this project go from here? Originally, like I said, I thought that this was just going to be like one conference paper. Honestly, in all the stuff that I'm pulling together here, this is my second book project now. I still have to write the first one, and that one is about half written at this point and might have a contract since it's in external review. But part of the tenure chase is that the horror of the tenure chase is that I'm working on one book and already need to think about the second one. So I think that this is going to be a second book project for me. In terms of the things that I'm doing design-wise, I don't think that I want to make anything that is directly about this. I have 2 games projects that, well, technically 3 games projects that are ongoing right now. However, in my next project, it is a detective ghost game that is about like World War II. And one of the things that I was having in the setting is that there were going to be Japanese soldiers and Korean laborers that were on this island. And I had an idea of like sequestering the Korean laborers into like a little like cave or something in the map the player could like stumble upon as a way of like critiquing what that labor represented. But when I was at the Mobilization Museum, one thing that I discovered was that when the Japanese were defending islands in World War II, that they like forced the Korean laborers to build all these like dugouts and the shelters and all sorts of things. But then they wouldn't let them use them during the during attacks. So a lot of these Korean laborers ended up like dying on the surface of these islands while the Japanese were in the dugouts and the trenches and these things that have been built. So I think that it might not be great to represent them as like being sequestered in the cave, but like having the ghosts of the Korean laborers on the surface would be more historically accurate and would be a better critique of that form of labor and the issues that came with that as well. Outside of that, I'm going to be continuing to play games, and I'm considering these new research questions potentially as conference papers. So I am going to stick with this through line of like Korean history in games, but these other smaller things that are coming up here, I think would make great like smaller conference papers and be building me towards a larger book project. For any of you who are interested, these are the sources that I have been that I've read so far or I'm reading through. I'm going to let this sit here for a second because I plan on turning this into a YouTube video. So this is your last chance to see these without pausing. And thank you very much. I look forward to your